Open the pod bay doors now.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with your brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away...
46.56 degrees.
Thank you very much for that overly kind welcome. Okay, so we're going to see Moneyball, which was a very good movie. Even my wife liked it, which was surprising to me. But I want to spend a few minutes sort of talking about a little bit of the backstory here and trying to kind of set the stage for what you're going to see in the film. So, what you're going to see is a story about, it's obviously about baseball, but it's about how statistical analysis can be used to make better decisions in baseball. And part of that story goes all the way back to when baseball started. And we still don't know exactly when that was, but we know it was sometime in the now early part of the 1800s. It used to be the middle of the 1800s. Now it's the early part of the 1800s. And they had professional baseball by the late 1800s, but by the early 1900s, so baseball has been professionalized now, and now you have the concept of people who want to know what happened in the game without having actually been there. And so you've got people who are writing stories about what happened in the game, narrative stories like the kinds that you read in the paper. But for the first time, a New Yorker named Henry Chadwick began publishing box scores, and so this is a very low-resolution image of a box score. I don't know if you can read that, but this was the first. He was the first person to go about recording a numerical record of what happened in the game, not just a story about who won and who hit a home run or whatever. And I think one of the things that's remarkable about this is that this box score is not that different than the one that you would see in the Daily Hampshire Gazette today. You can see that, for each team in each inning, like how many runs they scored, how many hits, and for each player, how many times they came up, how many hits they had, and that kind of thing. And so we're still using this today, and it's sort of a remarkable invention. But this was the beginning of people using numerical summaries of the game to talk about what happened in the game. And as that process continued, people got more and more interested in what they could learn from the statistics that people had recorded about the game. And by the late 1940s, so 1947, Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers at the time, signed Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson became the first black American to play professional Major League Baseball. And the same year, Branch Rickey had another innovation. I think it's fair to say that Branch Rickey was thinking outside the box in 1947. And he hired a man named Allan Roth, who you see pictured here, to be the first statistician for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And this was the first time that a Major League front office employed a statistician whose job it was to try and extract some kind of insights from baseball data. And he was in Branch Rickey's ear. There was this long spread that was published in Life magazine shortly thereafter. In that, he had basically discovered what we now call OPS, or on-base plus slugging percentage. And so this was a statistic that went beyond, if you go back to the box score, and let's go back here for a second. All we're trying to do here is count what happened, right? So you see like how many hits each player got and how many at-bats and so on and so forth. But there's no attempt to actually analyze the data. But by the time you got to Allan Roth, people had made that leap from, okay, like we can record what happened numerically, but let's see if we can actually do something to learn something about the game of baseball. And Allan Roth is in many ways the predecessor to some of the characters that we're going to see tonight, and myself. Oh, that did not work out so well. Okay, well, you'll have to imagine what that looks like over on this side of the screen. Okay, so by the late 70s and into the 80s, Bill James was the figure who really popularized sabermetrics. So he's called the godfather of sabermetrics. Sabermetrics, by the way, is the term for statistical analysis of baseball. And it comes from the acronym SABR, which is the Society for American Baseball Research. So it has nothing to do with swords. But it was Bill James who coined this term. But this was the first time, so after Bill James had written some of his books, that people started to think about this as like a field of research. And there were some actually fairly influential academic papers, but Bill James was the primary person who was like really pushing the ball forward here. And you can see the top half of the cover of one of his books. But I think what was special about him is that he was able to, he wrote well, and he had these incredible insights. So who was Bill James? He was a night watchman at a pork and beans factory in Kansas. That's a true story. And he had a lot of time on his hands. And he didn't have a computer. I really actually still struggle to imagine how he did this kind of work, because I'm essentially wedded to my computer. But he was somehow, I believe, manually at some level, like tabulating statistics, and then again, sort of using them to come up with these insights about the game. So a couple of the concepts that he came up with here are listed here: runs created, Pythagorean expectation, win shares, range factor. I can tell you about what those things mean if you want, but they're all attempts to go beyond what we had seen in the box score, right? So not just counting things, but now actually trying to combine those counts in such a way that you come up with a measurement of something that tells you something about the game. So in the case of range factor, for example, it was an attempt to come up with a better way to measure defense. So the way that Henry Chadwick, who wasn't interested in measurement, just recording, but the way that people evaluated defense was based on fielding percentage. And all that meant was, did you make an error on the play or not? And there's a lot of problems with that statistic. Range factor was an attempt to not just say, like, okay, did you make an error on that play, but how many balls do you actually get to? Which is like a fundamentally different concept and a fundamentally different way to measure defense. And it turns out a better way, although we don't use range factor much anymore, but that's sort of another story. So anyway, Bill James, again, is very influential in this field. And it was the quality of the writing and the quality of his insights that really kind of pushed the ball forward. Okay, and this is important for us because, so Moneyball, the movie you're about to see, the book was published in 2003. It was written about the 2002 Oakland A's season. And I think it's important to try and imagine, or remember for all of us, what life was like in 2002. And in particular, maybe even what life was like sort of a decade before that. So the internet was a thing in 2002, but it wasn't really a thing in like 1992. I'm sure it existed, but people weren't using it. And so the way that we can now sort of go online and download all the baseball data that has ever been collected, you couldn't do that back then. And so people like Bill James were, part of their contribution was collecting this data and then analyzing it. And what happened when these data started to spring up on the internet is that you had these communities that grew up, and not only were they pitching in to collect more data about baseball and then sharing it for free, but they were talking about their ideas about how you could analyze that data. And that's sort of where we were in about 2002. So, there's a small online community of people doing this work, and it's not easy to get data, although some of it is out there. And that's when some of the ideas that are discussed in the movie really started to take shape. because you need the data to verify the ideas, and you need the ability to communicate with other people to do that kind of work. So what you'll see in the movie are some ideas that sprang up kind of in this environment, and I think what's important to think about is what it would have meant to be an early mover within the baseball industry at that time. Right, so these were not mainstream ideas. These were ideas that only people who had a real interest in this stuff were exposed to. Okay, so after Moneyball, so like I said, Moneyball was written about the 2002 season, published in 2003. I was hired by the Mets. My first day was January 2004. And so the Mets were one of the early movers in terms of hiring full-time people to do statistical analysis work in a major league front office. There were other teams who were in on it, but it was still very early back then, and it was in a very real sense driven by what happened in Moneyball. Okay, so I want to kind of set the stage, and some of you may be thinking like, okay, jerk, like you used to work for the Mets and now you're teaching statistics at Smith College, so like why would you want to do that? And it's a fair question. There's a bigger story here, I think. And what you're going to see is a movie about a baseball team and some people who are looking at data, analyzing that data, coming up with ideas, using that data to then inform the decision-making in their domain of expertise, which happens to be baseball in this case. But I think the bigger idea is that these skills and those ideas can apply to any industry, really anything. Anywhere that you have data, like you can do the same kind of thing that people are doing in this film in that industry. And you can see it here. So this is part of what motivates me to do the work that I'm doing now is, me and some of my colleagues in the audience out there, we're trying to train the next generation of data scientists. The people that you see in this movie, one of the characters, Jonah Hill's character, he's essentially a data scientist. And if baseball's not your cup of tea, these kinds of skills are applicable to almost any industry. Right down the street here in Amherst, you have MassMutual has started a new data science development program. They're spending millions of dollars on this, and it's basically Moneyball for insurance. The insurance industry, as I understand it, which is not well, is almost unbelievably archaic in terms of, there's a lot of like physical paper being pushed around and human beings making decisions that probably could be made by an algorithm. And that's part of what they're investing in. And again, it's really this big idea of like, we can do better, we can make better decisions if we actually stop to analyze these data. So I think that's a big idea here. So as far as the film goes, I'm actually really excited to see this. I haven't seen it in a long time. And whenever I see movies, so being one of the rare people who's had the privilege to work in a front office, whenever you see movies about baseball, like I'm immediately trying to, focus on the things that seem real or don't seem real. And so these are a couple things that stood out to me. So the first thing is you're going to see Jonah Hill. Did he get nominated for an Academy Award for this role? Yes. Something like that? Yeah, okay. So in an Academy Award nominated role, Jonah Hill is playing a character named Peter Brand. And Peter Brand is a composite character. The real life person that this is based on is a man named Paul DePodesta. Paul DePodesta later worked for the Mets. I worked with him. I've met him. I've talked to him about this. And he worked with the filmmakers during the making of Moneyball. And at some point, it became clear to both parties that what they wanted to do with the character, he wasn't really comfortable with. And what you'll see in the movie is that, like, Jonah Hill's character is, he's sort of like short and overweight and unathletic and intimidated by other people, and that is not Paul DePodesta. Paul DePodesta like played 2 sports at Harvard, and he's not intimidated to talk to people, and he's like tall and thin and athletic. So that's one thing that anyway, one thing that stands out to me. There's a scene, which you'll see, obviously, sort of, I think, toward the beginning, where Billy Beane, so the main character in the movie is Billy Beane. He's the general manager of the Oakland A's, and he goes to Cleveland to talk about a trade. And this is an interesting scene, which I would urge you to pay attention to. I don't want to spoil it by saying what I think now. Maybe we can talk about it afterwards. But pay attention to that scene. Anything written on a whiteboard, especially in any movie that has anything to do with math, like look carefully at the whiteboard. It's very often nonsense. And I don't remember, based on my when I watched the movie last time, whether this is nonsense or not, but I'll be looking carefully at that. Anytime you see scouts on the screen, so in part of the aftermath of Moneyball was this sort of scouts versus stat guys debate. And that's a theme that's explored in the movie. So anytime the scouts are on screen, be thinking to yourself, like, does this character seem plausible? Those scenes are always fun. So former actual Major League shortstop Royce Clayton actually plays Miguel Tejada in this movie. And former minor leaguer Stephen Bishop plays David Justice. So I thought that was interesting that you see some actual baseball talent on the screen. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say about that. We should watch the movie. I do have a couple ideas to throw at you afterwards, and I'll certainly stick around for a Q&A. So, yeah, let's watch the movie. Thank you for coming. This is not a particularly complicated idea. The idea is just that getting on base is important, perhaps more important than batting average. And that's the kind of idea that you can find evidence for that simply using the statistics that we talked about in Henry Chadwick recording in the box score. So since then, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and this is an illustration of this idea of catcher framing. And the idea here is that, so what you're looking at it's the same catcher, and it's the same umpire, actually, and the pitch is thrown in the exact same location in each time. I'm sorry, it's 2 different catchers. The pitch is thrown in the same location in each case. It's the same umpire. And in one case, it's called a strike, and in the other case, it's called a ball. And what people, so this is the notion that the catcher is framing the pitch. That is, there's something about the way that he's catching the ball that makes it appear to be a strike. And this was a skill that scouts believed that catchers had for a long time, and have continued to talk about how catcher framing is important. And at the time of Moneyball, you heard Billy Beane say that defense didn't matter. And a lot of people also thought that things like catcher framing didn't matter because every time we tried to measure them, we didn't find an effect. So since then, we have better data. And when people, so now the data is based on camera tracking, so that we get the exact location of the pitch, not just like an eyeball and somebody marks a piece of paper. And what people found when they studied this was that, in fact, catcher framing is real, and it's actually really valuable. And since then, there have been noticeable kind of shifts in the market for catchers where teams are actually signing catchers who can't hit, but do a really good job of framing for a lot of money. So this is kind of like the second wave of Moneyball. Okay, so that's, here's the second example of that. So again, you see the same 2 different catchers, the same umpire here, the same pitch location, and in one case it's called a strike, in one case it's called a ball. So if you can see, Jose Molina on the left, has this like very slight movement of his glove, and it's always within the strike zone. Whereas over here, Ryan Domit, you see like a fairly dramatic stab like that, and that's what they're talking about. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about. I do have some books. So I wrote a book called The Sabermetric Revolution. Actually, the original title was Moneyball Revisited, but they wouldn't let us use that. And we talked about Moneyball a lot. So if you're interested, now that you've seen the movie, if you're interested in these ideas and you want some more thoughts about it, I have those, and I'll sign them for you. It's $20 cash or check. There's also a promo code if you want to go online and get a 20% discount. And I am happy to take questions for as long as people have questions. Yes?
Yes, I was just curious about the idea that, defense doesn't seem to be a big indicator.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that. When you think about like a shortstop, a lot of people talk about the range,
Mm-hmm.
they can cover, stop these things going to the
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about defense, and does it in fact not matter? And it does matter. It matters a lot, as you might suspect. So again, this is one of those ideas sort of similar to what we were just talking about, where at the time of Moneyball, I think what happened was we couldn't really measure defense that well. And so if you can't measure it, then maybe it doesn't exist. But later we got better data, and it turns out that when you measure it, it does matter. So yeah, I think defense absolutely matters. And the hard part, with defense is knowing where everyone is at all times, right? So in the data that we talked about at the beginning, it's like they didn't record that at all. They just recorded like whether the ball was caught or not. They didn't know where the players were. And when I was working for the Mets, we had data where people would watch the game on TV and mark like with their eyes, like where they thought the ball was. And so we got that, and we were able to do something with that. Now we have data where they actually track all the players on the field using cameras, and it's like a whole new ball game as far as being able to do that. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm really not much about baseball, but I know.
Okay, that makes two of us.
I'm interested in the philosophical question.
Mm-hmm.
So, two things. One is that the data all seems to be about individual players.
Mm-hmm.
The players are almost operating as a team.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent do you think the way the different players interact, is that factored into the algorithm somehow? And I guess the other question I had was about the scouts versus the sabermetrics.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that sort of do you think that the scouts are sort of intuitively operating on the basis of some kind of unconscious algorithm?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those are really two really good questions. Yes. So I'm going to repeat the second question because it's fresh in my mind, and then I'm going to have to ask you to remind me of what the first question was. But right, okay. I'm still going to have to ask you to remember. Now I forgot the second question. Right. Okay. Scouts versus stats. Yes. So this is yet another thing that I think we've kind of peeled back from a little bit. You saw the depiction in Moneyball, and the scouts were depicted as basically being worthless and not knowing anything. I think that opinion has changed since then, and I don't know that we do have a way to measure this yet. But it seems clear among all 30 teams that nobody fired their scouts. Like, we all kept the scouts. And while teams have certainly been using more statistical analysis to inform their decisions, it's very clear to me that scouts have a real contribution to make. And yes, I do. So the way I like to think about it is both scouts and statistical analysts are trying to do the same thing. Right? They're trying to predict the future performance of baseball players, and that's a hard thing to do. For me, as a statistical analyst, I'm trying to do that using algorithms based on a database and models. But for the scouts, it's like their database is the games that they've seen. And, their algorithms are whatever, something in their head. And, they're drawing on their experience to try to make that same judgment. So absolutely, they have a contribution. I think it's a different kind of contribution. What statistics is, I think, really good at is, like, we can record the events from all the games, right? So, like, hundreds of games over many seasons, and like we can kind of be there for all of them. And the scouts can't do that, but they can watch in a more precise way in certain cases. Okay, and then the first question about sort of individuals versus teams. So I think baseball is a game that is sort of naturally more individual in a lot of ways. One player hits, one player pitches, and yes, when the ball's in play, the fielders interact. But a lot of the action in baseball is like very individual. In basketball and soccer and football and sports like that, hockey, which are not like that at all, right? Where so now like all of the teams involved all of the time, I think they have a much harder time with a lot of this stuff. Mathematically it's just simpler to assume independence of the actors, right? And so this is what we do. And in baseball, it seems to work pretty well. In other sports, not so much, and you have to start in it from a completely different place.
Just Paul, do you think that that's a fairly realistic assumption for baseball?
I think for certain things, yeah. Like, I don't think that what the left fielder is doing that much matters to the batter when he's hitting. But, obviously on the defensive side, that's certainly less true.
Following up on what you said,
Yeah.
so would these analytics lend itself best for predictive quality, like tennis?
Well, I would think so, yeah. Tennis is in many ways like an even simpler game. Yeah. Yeah, and there are people doing that work. Yes.
So I can't remember the book I read. It was another statistical analysis, and he looked at some of the common traditional statistics and said why they, for example, win, why that shouldn't be valued. One of the big things he did was saying basically the composition, the way you do your pitching staff from a game should be like you throw 4 or 5 pitchers every game, maybe one pitch is 1 inning, one pitch is 2. And so all these teams doing all this statistical analysis, but why aren't they really doing kind of radical things that the analysis is showing? Like, some teams position players, but really there's a lot more radical things that can be done based on the statistics. So why is there that not happening?
Yeah. So the question was about why don't more teams do some of the radical theories that statistical analysts have? So it's funny you mentioned that, because when Billy Beane didn't take the Red Sox job, they hired Theo Epstein. Theo Epstein was, I think, 28 years old at that time. And he had read Bill James. And Bill James wrote about the use of relief pitchers and how the typical way that managers use relief pitchers is they have their best relief pitcher pitch the 9th inning to get a save. And a save is it's a statistic, and basically if you come into the game and your team is winning by no more than 3 runs, and you finish the game and your team wins, then you get a save. And Bill James's criticism of this was that the game is often on the line in the 7th inning, or the 8th inning, or the 6th inning even. And it's at that most critical juncture where you want your best pitcher in the game. So why don't you, he called it the relief ace. So rather than the closer, take your relief ace and put him in the game when the game is at the most critical juncture. And Theo Epstein tried to do this with the Red Sox in 2003, and the closer blew a few games, and the media went crazy, and they stopped doing it. And that's the last time anyone's tried to do that. I think, so in some ways maybe that's silly, but in other ways, these guys are human beings, and I think there's something to be said for the management strategy of, telling not only the closer, but everyone else on the team that, that's the guy who's going to pitch the 9th inning, and he knows that, he can sort of pace his, his getting ready routine because he knows when that's coming. And if he loses, it's like, well, I had my guy in there and he lost, so what do you want? It's a sort of like you can't second guess the manager when he does that. Yeah.
Well, just to follow up, so he went back to other relievers who would come in 5th, 6th, 7th, and pitch like Wally Fingers, those guys. And he said they were doing it back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. That's got away from it.
Well, so it's true that relief pitchers used to pitch longer. They used to pitch, 2-3 innings routinely. It's also true that teams used to carry fewer pitchers on their roster. So you might only have 9 pitchers instead of now most teams have 13. And I think the thing that I wonder about is, are we sure that they pitched any better? Yes, they pitched longer, but do we know that they pitched more effectively? And I think that's a complicated question because it depends on the quality of the hitting, and I'm not sure how you would control for that. But my guess is that they didn't, and that the current philosophy of like I'm going to bring in a new reliever every time is more optimal in some sense. That they're more likely to get those guys out. Yes.
Can you share any stories like when you were the Mets that maybe were controversial regarding debates between the statisticians and the scouts, or any amazing anecdotes?
I'm not sure that I can share those anecdotes. I can say that in my experience, the whole stats versus scouts thing was way overblown. It's certainly true that when I started in 2004, that there were some scouts who really weren't interested in statistics and kind of thought along the lines of what you saw. It wasn't nearly as pronounced as as dramatic as it was in the movie, and I think it didn't take very long for that idea to become sort of obviously not a good way to act on your like in front of your boss. So, I certainly by, 2006, 2007, like scouts understood in most clubs, certainly for the Mets, that like, if you're going to say stuff like that in front of the general manager, like, he's not going to want to hear that from you. So, there was, I think that thing got smoothed over much more rapidly than it appears here. Yeah.
To what extent do the analytics apply to the NCAA of the scout versus the,
Yeah, so this is another good question, and I think, the question was about to what extent do these ideas sort of apply to college baseball? And I think as you go down, so one thing that's nice about Major League Baseball is there's lots of data, and the data is collected in from essentially experiments that are very regulated, right? So they always play on like real fields, and they have umpires, and there's a lot of regularity in that data, and that makes it really nice for analyzing statistically. As you go down the ladder of the levels of competition, not only do you have fewer data or less data, but it's less reliable, and it's harder to compare. So for example, in college, if a Division I, if like University of Florida plays, College of Charleston, like how do you and so this is something that teams are actively working on, because in the draft that matters a lot, right? You're not going to look at a guy who's like hitting in D3 and he's hitting 550 and compare that to a guy who's hitting 350 in Division I. So one of the things that these people do is they try to fit models that account for that kind of balance, but it's hard. So what are you going to do? How are you going to make a decision if you can't trust your statistical analysis as much? Yeah, you're going to go to the scout and put a little more emphasis on what he thinks, or she.
Yeah, seems obvious that Dean took the risk that he had to take because it was in a small market, and he had the guts to take that risk and pioneer. But I'm wondering if you or Professor Zimbalist, he's an economist, isn't he?
That's correct.
Have you done, or do you know of anyone who's done an analysis of how analytics has leveled the competitive field given the consistency of the financial structure of the industry?
Yeah, so that's chapter 7. No, seriously. Yeah, we look at that. Actually, I think it's chapter 6, but yes. Yeah, of course. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was about how analytics has changed the nature of the competitive balance in pro sports, because of the idea that we got from the movie that the A's were able to try this experimental strategy because they sort of had nothing to lose. They were already like a small market team. I think the evidence is mixed on that. It's been a while since we wrote that chapter, but the yeah. So it's mixed. Yeah, back there.
And I have a two-part question. Is Mass Mutual the only insurance company doing that, or is that an industry-wide revolution? And also, what does insurance look like after it's been Moneyball?
Okay. So the question was about Mass Mutual and insurance, and whether, so are other insurance companies doing what Mass Mutual is doing? I don't know. Maybe. I think they're definitely an early mover. I'm not going to say that they're the only mover on that. And what does insurance look like in the sort of... Yeah. So insurance... And I don't know a lot about insurance, which will become obvious shortly. The industry is very regulated, so there's lots of things that you can't do. Obviously, a lot of those regulations are in place to prevent discrimination. So I think the idea of like a totally algorithmic insurance policy is probably not possible. But I can imagine that there may be ways in which they can kind of move down the road on that. So looking at, when you apply for insurance, life insurance, they give you a battery of tests. Take your blood sample, and they want to know if you have certain diseases and what your cholesterol levels and all that kind of stuff. So my understanding is that that information currently helps them put you in a bin with other people like you. But I don't know that there's like an algorithmic or statistical model that is determining those bins. So it may just be sort of, I don't know, some kind of colloquial historical thing that they have, and, I could imagine that you could do a better job doing some kind of statistical modeling. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I feel like every half the startups that we hear about, like the businesses, Google, Facebook, there's just like this explosion in machine learning, artificial intelligence. Does that factor into, is there a shift in this science related to that boom? Or if not, is it like a gradual, is that there, of those concepts that have forever, they're just being adopted?
So have the techniques in machine learning that we hear about a lot in like the tech industry, are they being used in baseball? Yeah, so actually this is one of the things that that has also changed. So Peter Brand, aka Paul D. Podesta, did major in economics at Harvard. And so I was an econ major. When I got the job with the Mets, I had a master's in applied math. And at that time, I think a lot of the people that you saw in that industry, there weren't many of them, but the people that were there tended to have that kind of background. So like an undergraduate degree in economics, maybe a master's degree. Now teams are hiring people with PhDs. So the Yankees have done this, the Dodgers have done this. There's 4 or 5, 6 people now who are, and these people are like leading a team of researchers. So definitely I think the methods have stepped up considerably.
Let's take time for 2 more questions.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Thanks for explaining all this. It seems in the movie, and for the first time, confidence plays so much a part of the performance.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's calculated as an algorithm. And then it's 2 parts, but I'm wondering how to keep, it seemed like part of reinforcing to players was showing them their stats, showing them what they were capable of.
Yep.
And how that plays a part.
Yeah, so it's also like a really interesting question. So the question was about confidence. It seemed like confidence played a big role in the movie, and how do we measure that statistically? So there was a guy, I think with the Orioles a while ago, who had a psychology background, and he was trying to do more with this sort of like measuring a player's confidence. I am not aware of any studies that have been able to help us in this regard. That said, I will say that people inside baseball definitely believe that confidence and psychology play a role. And so, with the Mets, we talked about this a lot in terms of like the pressure of playing in New York, and in particular whether certain people would have the mental. I guess I'll say fortitude, to be like a closer in New York, where if you blow the game, all the papers are just all over you the next day. And in some ways, it's sort of advantageous to be really dumb, like to just forget what happened. Like, I'm serious. And so, we had conversations about that idea. I don't know that we've really made any progress, and I don't know that anyone else has. So I think it's a real thing, but I don't think we've been able to measure it. What was your second question? Or was that enough? Okay, thank you. Sarah? Okay, yeah.
So how do you account for steroid use? Like,
Yeah.
there's such a dynamic variable people are using. Did you just assume if they use that if they have these outrageous that they would continue?
Well, no, I mean, so I don't know how to model that either. The problem is we don't actually know who did steroids or not. Now, yes, there's a handful of players who tested positive, but there's a lot of people who maybe were doing steroids and we didn't know about it, almost certainly. So how do you fit that model? I don't know. And I think the other problem...
Did you ever see like a paid player that would have an unbelievable year out of the blue?
Yeah.
How do you account for that? The suspicion might be there. You when looking over their on-base percentage or whatever that you actually...
Yeah, right, so this is one place where scouts can actually be helpful. I think they're probably better at surmising things like that than me for sitting behind a computer. The hard part is like, okay, so we can look at an individual player and try to make a determination about whether he's doing steroids or not. But like, how do you incorporate that into like a league-wide model? And I don't know. I don't know that anyone has really made any real progress on that either. I think the other thing is that like, we focus a lot on batters taking steroids and then hitting lots of home runs, but pitchers were taking steroids too. So it's not clear it's just not clear like how you would figure out who's doing what enough that you would have reliable data on that. It's a hard problem. Any other questions? Yes?
In terms of this whole Sabermetric Revolution, is there a role that kind of like gaming or virtual baseball or this kind of thing play toward the development of this, or is there a
Yeah, so simulation has been a useful tool. I don't know if you're familiar with a game called Stratomatic Baseball. Okay, so there you go. So you're a pioneer. A lot of the people who got into this, Bill James, I think, also, they played Stratomatic Baseball, which it sort of lays the groundwork for this idea of thinking about baseball probabilistically. And the guy who does this for the Red Sox now is a man named Tom Tippett, and he got his start writing a simulation for baseball. So you can put in different strategies, and it would play it out over the whole season, and that's what put him on the map. So yeah.
I have one final question.
Yes.
How did the Patriots come out when you did your study of all the pro sports teams and their use of
Yeah. So.
statistics?
They were up there, but not at the top. And I think there was an article, I think, in Sports Illustrated a while back about the Patriots, and they sort of have this guy, I forget his name now. No, not that guy. I remember his name. No, but he's like Belichick's confidant, and he's like not a real Patriots employee, or maybe he is, but like he doesn't. It's a little like shady, but he's the guy who is in Belichick's ear doing this kind of stuff. So yeah, the Patriots are in there, but they weren't at the top of the football team list. I don't think.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.